Welcome to this new episode of A Shot in the Arm podcast, Season 2. I'm Ben Plumley, and this is a podcast about global health and human rights, how we make sense of biomedical innovation and apply it to our daily lives. In planning this episode, I hoped originally to explore harm reduction, but I think the conversation with my guest will actually explore a question that straddles health and human rights, the not so often told story of the role of lawyers in beating back epidemics and promoting human rights. You can see it perhaps most visibly in the area of harm reduction, and that's services for people who inject drugs in order to reduce infectious diseases like HIV and viral hepatitis. There have been significant biomedical innovations in the last 30 years in helping people who use drugs, medicines like methadone that are used to treat drug dependency, with many more in the pipeline. But the crashing through the gates innovation is harm reduction, itself a raft of different public health and policy and legal services, which started with the strategy of clean needle exchange. It's not just a question of medicine pushing the boundaries of what can be acceptable society, but how people within the movements, people within the legal system, how they have helped activists to persuade politicians to act. This week, we meet Kathleen Fisher, respected litigator, human rights and women rights activist, who literally has saved thousands of lives through her relentless protection of HIV prevention services. Now, we can start with a definition of harm reduction that's used by Harm Reduction International and adopted by the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, UNODC, and they define it as policies, programs and practices that primarily reduce the adverse health, social and economic consequences of the use of legal and illegal psychoactive drugs without necessarily reducing drug consumption. And this approach emerged in the early 1980s at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, as policymakers, health workers and lawyers realized that punitive strategies to arrest people who inject drugs had no impact on inverting new infections, and in fact, they actually pushed HIV infection underground. So, instead, AIDS organizations started to provide clean needles to people who inject drugs, rather than solely trying to achieve abstinence. Since those days, harm reduction has come to mean much, much more. As well as needle exchange, services include safe injection sites, easy access to opioid replacement therapy like methadone, primary healthcare and mental health services that people who inject drugs might otherwise not access. Harm reduction services are considered to have been born in Europe and Australia in the mid-1980s, and programs rapidly followed suit in New York and San Francisco. You can find programs now all over the world, including the Ukraine, China, Brazil, and famously in Portugal, which has incorporated harm reduction seamlessly into its National Health Service and has seen a breathtaking reduction in HIV and other infectious diseases. But it's to San Francisco that we return, because that's a place where medicine and the law come crashing together. San Francisco's first HIV injection drug use program was launched in November 1988 on Eddy Street, west of Taylor Street. It was called Prevention Point, and it provided people with clean needles, safe injection equipment, and HIV awareness information, all wheeled about in a baby carriage, or pram, as those of us who speak English like to call it. The Mary Poppins, you might say, of harm reduction. But this program caused extensive controversy in California and the US. In the early 90s, state legislators tried and grappled with the issue, and they tried to pass laws, only to have them vetoed by the state of California Governor Pete Wilson in 92, 93 and 94. So, almost as an act of desperation and to bypass state opposition, the communities in San Francisco pressed elected officials to declare a citywide state of emergency in 92, and this enabled the city to enact life-saving interventions. They were able to allocate $138,000 to the city's needle exchange program. Well, today, The San Francisco Community Health Center and the San Francisco AIDS Foundation and the Department of Public Health say they distribute 4.45 million needles to 22,000 injection drug users. And for those of us working to fight the AIDS epidemic, harm reduction is an established component of the HIV public health response. But not all countries are willing or able to embrace the hard legal change of decriminalizing needle exchange. When we pause to consider people most affected by HIV through shared needles now, maybe our imaginations go to the blasted post-industrial wastelands of Eastern Europe, where pasty-skinned and distracted young people share needles, while avoiding persecution from the hard-men dictators and their oligarchs who really frankly eliminate them rather than treat them. And that opposition, from hesitancy to downright opposition, is a prejudice sitting just there under the surface. The balance towards supportive legal policy, driven by evidence-informed public health, is by no means a given. Whether it's restricting access to reproductive health and related services, or recriminalization of same-sex relationships, we need to constantly look back to our recent past and learn from our successes and failures. Just because we obtain all our news, all our information and content from our personal devices does not mean that the past has no purpose. So, to help us make sense of the battle between health and the law, and to hear one person's story of their persistence and passion, I'm honoured to welcome today to A Shot in the Arm podcast my dear friend, Kathleen Fisher. Welcome to A Shot in the Arm, Kathy.
Thank you, Ben.
So a little bit about you for people who don't know you, and correct me where I'm wrong. You're an attorney. For international people, that means lawyer.
Correct.
And you're a partner in the hugely respected Calvo, Fisher and Jacob. You've got offices in Guam and San Francisco and Saipan.
All true.
And you came up the ranks of Morrison Foster. You were the head of the litigation department from 93-96. You are a get out the vote champion, particularly in the state of Nevada, and was there during the 2016 presidential election and the 2018 midterms.
I have to correct you a little there. That was really my daughter, Maya, and I was just doing what she told me to do. That sort of brings me to how we know each other through Pangaea. You were a board member and I was the chief executive of Pangaea, and I did exactly as you told me to do. So, oh, Ben, I wish.
You've had a long history in the HIV response, particularly. You won the 2004 Leadership Award from the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. And as I said, you were on my board at Pangaea for a number of years. You're California born and bred. Can you tell us a bit about your upbringing and how service became important to you?
Well, I was raised in Orinda. You know, I'm a third generation Californian. My parents, one of them was an engineer. My mother, was a writer and worked in advertising agencies. She was kind of, if you've seen Mad Men, she was Peggy. And I think that in terms of service, I am really just such a child of the 60s and the anti-war movement. And, when I was in law school, back in the Stone Age in the kind of early 70s, we were watching the Watergate hearings. I mean, how can you not be, part of, what's going on in our country now and, more in general? The really wonderful part of the legal profession, that is about service. And at that time was part of the civil rights movement. I went to Martin Luther King Law School in Davis. And it's just always been a part of who I am, particularly as a lawyer.
What drew you to law as opposed to other social movements, as it were?
Well, frankly, growing up watching Perry Mason and just completely identifying with Perry Mason. And till, at various times, people explained to me, that I wasn't a man. And, and at that point, there were, no one you ever saw in a courtroom on television or otherwise, who was a woman lawyer. And so after I graduated from college, I did social work, went to a community organization in East Oakland, where we were, working with people like the Black Panther Party, doing breakfast programs and other social justice, issues. And the people who were on the scene were lawyers, helping us get shit done, as we used to say back then and still now. It was legal aid lawyers. It was National Lawyers Guild lawyers, some of whom, are now very famous and the subject of books, some of whom were just there for us every day, figuring out how to help people just, get through the maze of issues that concerned, poor people mostly at the time, but also all those structural issues that have to do with, why you become a lawyer.
I want to come back to the role law has played in many of the social movements you've been a part of. But first, your career kicks off basically sort of the same time HIV does, and many of the people we've had on the show, like both of us, I guess, have found ourselves coming of age. And professionally, particularly so, as HIV hits, as the AIDS epidemic hits, and they've either found their life's purpose through HIV, or they found that it's pulled them in directions that they really hadn't expected. How did you first come across HIV?
In just a very personal way. When I started at MoFo, in 1976, the managing partner at the time, who was a great fighter for all of us who were, women in the profession, became ill early in the epidemic. He was completely in the closet. One of my very close, really friends, a hugely successful, U.S. Supreme Court law clerk, went to another firm in the city, also got sick early in the epidemic. And so it was really just completely and totally personal. And although I must say it was, at this time when, as women, we were facing a lot of obstacles too, in law firms, in the professions. There was, just early stage women's rights issues being litigated, in the courts. And there was just this alliance that was formed between us and the gay men in our communities, within our network of friendships, that just made it very personal. And then my best friend at MoFo, who kind of came years later, again, highly credentialed individual, who came late in the day and, out of a Republican administration, and out of the Reagan administration, for God's sake, and he came and, he explained to me that I was a monkey liberal who, knew nothing. And I explained to him that he was a fascist Republican pig. And we became really like best friends.
Yeah.
And he got sick and died, later in the epidemic, right before, in 1994.
Oh, just before the appearance of the
just
cocktail.
before all of the Lazarus stories. So, I just had this, completely continuing personal motivation.
So two things. I guess I should explain to our listeners and viewers, and that is that, and this is a mistake I made when I first came to the Bay Area. MoFo is not what you might think it is. It is actually the abbreviation of Morrison Foster, the law firm, right?
Yes, that is true.
And then there's also something, as you talk about some of your colleagues, there's a bit of the Ray Cohen about this, the Angels in America, the evil New York lawyer who was horrendously opposed to all forms of civil rights, but who unfortunately, in the Angels of America trilogy, himself is struck down by HIV. Did you see a lot of that sort of self-discrimination going on around you?
Certainly, no one like Roy Cohen was ever.
Roy Cohen, that's right.
Roy Cohen was ever, part of any circle that involved, Morrison and Foerster or anything that, I ever met up with in my travels as a lawyer. And I must say, I think only in retrospect and the perspective of that part of the reason that MoFo itself, became such a powerful force for good, during the epidemic was that it was formed in really response to the East Coast power structure and firms and culture, if you will. But what I do really, what did really happen is that the person I described as the managing partner, when he died, I had to read the 23rd Psalm at Grace Cathedral to the entire legal community. And we couldn't mention the word AIDS in San Francisco in 1989 because his family did not know that he was sick and was never told that. And in 1994, when my best friend died and we did a funeral in D.C., we could not mention that he died of HIV because of the issues that were presented for our then D.C. office about what was going on in Washington at the time.
Wow. And you think, here we are entering 2020 and so much has changed and yet so little. I mean, there was a question I wanted to ask you, and as you know, I've been heavily involved in the business response to AIDS really since its inception, and we always used to look back to these sort of legacy companies here in the Bay Area that were supposed to be champions of human rights and champions of a more progressive approach to HIV. But there's a real tension, a real battle that people have to go through in order to get there, in order to be able to talk about HIV in the workplace, talk about one of your colleagues has died of HIV-related causes. So,
well, yes, and yes, and the powerful thing about what happened in San Francisco, and I speak better about the law firms than I do the companies, is that at least we got to have the conversation full out, and have the hard conversations about are we going to mention that our colleague died in the legal community and what he died of at a point where, the Chronicle wouldn't print those obituaries. And so one of the law firms took on the Chronicle, my friend's law firm, we happened to honor the wishes of the two people who had died. But to this day, that was the education for me in that, remember what the famous ACT UP formulation was, silence is death. Silence was death for two of my, best friends and colleagues, during the epidemic, in large part as a result of the decisions that the law firm and they mediated about their illness. So, it was complicated.
So talk about complications, and you're never backwards in coming forwards, as my grandmother was used to say. You became heavily involved in legislation and legal action, speaking out truth to power around harm reduction. And at the introduction to this episode, I gave a description of what harm reduction is, needle exchange, and the range of services that go with that. Why was that so important to you? Why was harm reduction so important to you?
Well, first of all, we didn't call it harm reduction, and perhaps it's my perspective as a lawyer, but by the time you're talking about, I was on the mayor's HIV task force, which comprised just an extraordinary group of people. Art Agnos originally formed it back in the late 80s. And so Don Francis was the head of that task force. And there was the everyone you can imagine, the Archbishop of San Francisco, a number of other, incredible people, Lee Smith, the head of Levi International.
Yeah. Yep.
And I got to be on it because I was the managing partner of MoFo's San Francisco office at the time. Bless their hearts that they put me in with the opportunity to do that. So that was a huge education for, all of our different constituencies about what we now call harm reduction. So needle exchange, about the same time as the immigration barriers, to people coming into the city, about the time as the understanding was shifting about the role of HIV drug use and also the prevalence in the African American and Latino communities. So it was really through education, including by, just some of the complete heroes of the epidemic, Marty Delaney, from Project Inform. If you've ever heard Marty Delaney, who's a Jesuit by background, talk to the Archbishop of San Francisco about, I'm not sure you would call this harm reduction, maybe it's prevention, but he was talking to him about phone sex and the necessity of promoting and permitting, phone sex, as part of the continuum of trying to prevent the spread of HIV.
So Marty Delaney, the one of the co-founders of Project Inform, who sadly passed, I guess, around 10 years ago. And it's funny that you talk about him talking with the Archbishop of San Francisco, because in the mid-2000s, I was at UNAIDS and was assigned to be the focal point to the mission of the Holy See in Geneva. And we would be spending our time saying, well, no, you really need to correct these facts around, condoms, do protect against HIV. And frankly, having condoms with holes in them would really take away the whole point of condoms. That being said, the Catholic Church, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, was absolutely incredible in terms of scaling up HIV treatment. It was really on prevention that was the challenge. But in preparing for this interview, Kathy, I've been looking back at the records and looking at the history of what happened in San Francisco, and it does feel a little sanitized, and that somehow San Francisco was this beacon of progression and setting the way. Was that the case? And if it was, how did it come about? What was your role in it?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure, about the whole retroactive version of San Francisco being the beacon. In retrospect, it felt, very scary and messy, and with lots of heartbreaking setbacks, and then, the just sense of urgency, that drove everyone forward, where everything was on the table. And I give, in terms of the task force I've described, that I think really educated broad sections of the community, not too late in the epidemic, we're talking late 80s. There was, I give a lot of credit to Don Francis and his just complete sense of urgency about, people who were dying. And then I give a lot of credit to, the AIDS Foundation and to
The San Francisco
the
AIDS Foundation.
San Francisco AIDS Foundation, and their just incredible focus on the mission. You know, I mean, as lawyers, you're always serving the mission, but the fact was that everything was on the table. Civil disobedience. One of my regrets is that before we got needle exchange sort of kind of legalized, the Don Francis and I were planning to do a show trial in San Francisco. Because the epidemiology wasn't there. We didn't have the facts. And the thing that lawyers, I think, really do bring to the table, is we're all about, having the facts. And all of the debate back then about whether you wanted to promote, drug use, versus whether you wanted to do harm reduction about AIDS by passing out needles, there just wasn't there was the epidemiology, but we needed to make it exciting and current and part of a court proceeding in order to make it real. So we had a whole plan around that.
So the show trial would have been not perhaps Soviet style, but more of a show and tell trial for the city of San Francisco to know what we do know and why what we now call harm reduction was the way to go. And you weren't able to do that.
Well, we succeeded and avoided the just fabulous opportunity to do that through other means. But no, not Soviet style at all. What we planned was a Brown versus Board of Education trial, where scientists from all over the country, would show up with studies about the efficacy, of needle exchange, basically. It would be in San Francisco Superior Court. It would be public, so there would certainly be a public education function, but we actually were looking for findings, about the fact that it was efficacious and legal if it was an emergency. Okay. But, but that's me, I'm a trial lawyer. I would have loved to put, all those, just heroes of the AIDS movement on the stand and the nature of the epidemic at that point, where, we were really looking at, how to deal with the HIV drug use and neonatal transmission and all of that, which was not understood.
And what I'm finding so interesting about this is, here I am trying to ask, so why needle exchange? Why injection drug users? But what you're saying is that there was an emergency for everything. Everybody knew that everything was sort of bound together, and we needed multiple, a sort of a action across all fronts.
Yes, that's exactly right. It was really all of the above, and all of the above immediately and urgently.
See, I find that fascinating, and so I'm going to share something and mention no names, but maybe about that time, and here we are in the early to mid 90s. I'm in London as a very much younger man than I am now, and early days of AIDS advocacy and AIDS action. And I can remember people saying to me that we really didn't want to touch drug users because they might detract from the hard work and achievements we were beginning to get from, normalizing white gay men who perhaps had greater, and inverted commas, needs for services than drug users. And it felt wrong at the time, pardon me, and there were people who were saying this is absolutely abhorrent. But did San Francisco experience this sort of, let's say, rating of need? People were more deserving than other people.
I am probably the third or fourth level of the ability to really tell the truth about that, because my perspective was as a lawyer. But I would certainly say that there was a feeling that there was a great sense of so many people are dying and there's so many needs. And the AIDS Foundation in San Francisco, should really be spending scarce resources on gay men. And truly the success of the model around that, was an argument for that. But what I will say is that all of the people who were really knowledgeable about the epidemic, the doctors who are well known to you, the heads of AIDS organizations who are well known to you, just really pushed against that and educated all of us about, what the nature of the epidemic was, and drug use, and about what drug users were all about. So there was this, sort of really robust discussion in which all of the corporate types like myself, lawyers and otherwise, were saying, well, yeah, suppose we pass out clean needles. These people are a mess. They're not really going to use them. I mean, how is that going to stop the spread of anything? Because these drug users are, just not people you can count on to use these clean needles. And so there was a huge amount of education about people such as ourselves, about the fact that these are people who have very organized lives.
Yes.
Who you talk about compliance with, a regime. They spend a lot of time and energy trying to get drugs, and the paraphernalia that they use to inject drugs. They're going to be the most compliant population on the face of the planet about using clean needles. And I mean, that seems like you're nodding at, like, of course, but back in the day, given how people felt about drug users, who were just these messes that no one wanted to see, that couldn't organize their lives, and, let's just ignore them. That was a novel concept.
Absolutely. It was very messy. And the mess was, if you like, on the policy side. Very quickly data came through showing that needle exchanged work. And yes, absolutely, drug users could absolutely control and manage this. I'm nodding because it makes me think of a shameless plug here for another podcast that I absolutely adore, The Oath, with Chuck Rosenberg. He recently interviewed Joyce Vance, who's the U.S. Attorney of the Northern District of Alabama. And during the Clinton administration, she was responsible for law enforcement around heroin deaths. And her initial approach, and she talks about this in the show, but her initial approach was, precisely, drug users cannot be expected to manage needle exchange, and it's much better for us to take a more adversarial approach, persecute and prosecute. And she said she was educated very early on about the primacy, if you like, of a public health approach, and much better to engage and to treat than to try and persecute and contain.
Well, I will say that I'm sure not all lawyers are like this, but whether they're prosecutors or big firm lawyers or in-house lawyers or local or state government lawyers, mostly what they're about is, first of all, trying to solve the problem. I mean, in an evidence-based way. And if they see something like imprisoning and persecuting everyone that's not solving the problem, most, but not all, are really able to see that. The second thing is most lawyers believe in the rule of law. And so, there's a way in which my faith, in a show trial or in, talking to other lawyers, like in the case of needle exchange, the city attorney for San Francisco, is the solution to a lot of problems, including it was back in the day. The trouble with the legal system, about something like needle exchange and the show trial I didn't get to have, with Don Francis, is that it's not fast. Too many people die before you get it done. So the much better avenue is if you can talk, in this case, Louise Rennie, who was the city attorney in San Francisco, into making it legal enough to pass out pass out needles, right?
Making it legal enough. But then there's also, as we have rewritten history or sanitized history, you look at the San Francisco city's state of emergency in 1993, and so that wasn't something that was bravely done by elected officials to take a stand against the state and the federal government. This was really pressure coming from the community and from scientists and advocates to get this done.
No, yes is the answer to that. It's absolutely true that the politicians, including the politicians in San Francisco, and I include, the mayor, the board of supervisors, everyone, embraced needle exchange like they were embracing a porcupine. I mean, they just wanted nothing to do with it. The excuse, which remained true, throughout, I think probably most of at least the until the mid 90s, is that it was illegal under state law. And it was going to remain illegal under state law. And so what can we do? We're just the city and county of San Francisco, was a really, I think, welcome, sort of buffer for the politicians who did not want people giving out needles to drug users. I mean, just period, end of story.
One of the other areas that you were involved in, and it's one of the darker sides of the AIDS response, which we get from time to time, and we're seeing this kind of denialism in a different way at the moment with vaccine hesitancy. But San Francisco had its experience in the early 2000s of AIDS denialism. So, just as President Mbeki in South Africa is convening his panel of AIDS denialists to explain why he shouldn't provide antiretrovirals in South Africa, a wave of AIDS denialism was hitting the city, and particularly a chapter of ACT UP, Golden Gate. And I know you were involved in that, and I don't know the extent to which you feel you're comfortable to be able to share some of that story and what really here in 2020 we should learn from that.
Well, I'm not sure what we should learn from that, but I do feel completely free to share the story, which played out in a very public way. And this is a role for the court system. I tried 2 cases, one on behalf of Project Inform, and the other on behalf of the AIDS Foundation to get injunctions against those AIDS denialists who were attacking scientists and attacking the heads of those organizations, throwing kitty litter at them, fake blood, really violently assaulting them, including at conventions, in all over the world, right? But also here in San Francisco. And so much, this has its complete legal analogy in the reproductive rights abortion provider context. And that was going on, had gone on quite a bit before, the injunctions that I was getting on behalf of the Project Inform and the AIDS Foundation. And those folks who, most of whom had HIV, there's some untold stories about it that are really important here. First of all, they were hugely funded. What really activated them to make them extraordinarily dangerous and effective was that they were funded by a pot club, a medical pot club here in San Francisco. And so they had lots of money to go around the world and to, spread their, violence and their message, that isn't well known. The other thing is that the San Francisco Police Department, and particularly a lieutenant there who I really want to give a shout out to, his nickname was Lieutenant Jack Ballantyne. He protected he protected the people in the AIDS organization. He protected us as lawyers. We were, of course, once we started defending, the both the people and the organizations from that group, we became targets. So he just, it was like Dragnet. If you grew up
Yeah.
here at a certain point, you always looked at Dragnet. Lieutenant Jack was always in the neighborhood, and he was always dropping by to see we were safe. He was always dropping by at court proceedings. He was dropped by at sort of dinners where those people were going to show up, and was just really incredibly behind the scenes there to make sure that people were safe, which they were not at that point. I mean, those people were desperate, they were dangerous, and they were true believers.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge tragedy about this. I mean, I think most of the protractors from that side are dead, are no longer with us. And the same is true for, this sort of comes in waves. There was a wave of AIDS denialism in the UK in the early 90s, and it was called Gays Against Genocide. And it's one of the things that really got me more involved in advocacy. But there is something about the human condition, something that really makes us want to ignore, more than that, willfully defy the evidence that is in front of us. And you mentioned the fight in reproductive health, and it sort of brings me on to your leadership in women's rights and women's advocacy. And I wanted to the extent possible, you can strike similarities between what you've seen in HIV and what you've seen in the transformation of the role of women in society.
Let me say something else first about the AIDS denialists and that period of time. What I want to say about that is that, first of all, that is an arena where lawyers and courts can be very effective. We got bubble zone injunctions against all of those people.
Bubble zone, what does that mean?
It means like a certain amount, of basically feet, 100 feet from, individuals and the organization itself. Those people can't come. Otherwise, you can call and have them, dragged off to jail. And, they're very controversial and have been controversial in the reproductive rights aspect, because you're always mitigating the First Amendment right to protest versus the right of certain people who are prone to violence to cross those lines. So so the courts really stood up there. I mean, those are very controversial injunctions, and there were two different judges in San Francisco who protected both the organizations and the individuals who were subject to attack. The second thing I want to say that I can't say very specifically in terms of organizations or the individuals who, you're right, are mostly dead. But the organizations involved and the individuals involved who they viciously attacked took care of them at the end of their lives. Mm. And so what I learned from that, and it was just such a life lesson, is that what matters is who we are, not who they are. And a part of our mission is to take care and provide comfort to people who are dying of HIV. That's what we're going to do, no matter what harm they caused, during their lives for whatever their reasons were. So,
and that can be broadened. I mean, if it is our mission to serve and to care, we will do that regardless.
Yes, exactly. But I think it took a lot of leadership from the organizations, who, were also responsible for the safety of the people who were providing care to those folks.
And I think that story is true all over the world. These people ended up being cared for by the very people they were opposed to so violently. But But I can't believe I'm doing this. I'm trying to get you back to women's rights.
I know. I feel like I'm sort of having to choose, and it's really
well.
For
don't
me,
choose. Tell
never
me.
been a choice.
Yes. Tell me about that.
Okay. Well, in thinking about what you might ask today, what really came to mind is that women's rights to me have been so just part of the fabric of gay rights, if you want to use that term as opposed to specifically about HIV. Because when I came into, practice and into this work, there was just such an alliance. We all saw ourselves as sometimes under attack, mostly not included, sometimes, not welcome, and but almost always misunderstood, in terms of our motivations. And so it's just been to me, a very seamless perspective, I guess is what you'd call it. So when I went to MoFo in the mid 70s, there was kind of a cohort of women, instead of like one or two here and there, I came in with a group, and so there were more of us than just, one or two here and there. So we, with the support particularly of our gay male colleagues, just full out had these just ridiculous discussions about whether or not there would be maternity leave and whether it would be paid for, and whether or not, and I've just got to give a lot of credit to my women who became my women partners, who would sit there and calmly talk to, some retrograde, male partners who were in charge about, well, that's okay. I guess I could come in right after I had the baby. Of course, I'd be, bleeding all over the chair and expressing breast milk, and that would be perhaps uncomfortable for the clients I would need to, be working with that day. But if that's the way you really feel about it, yeah.
It sort of brings it back to me. I mean, the same with harm reduction. We now have what we think are established practices. There are still, of course, countries that wouldn't provide maternity leave to young mums in the workplace. But I guess the big question that I've been wanting to ask you is, to what extent do you think these are new traditions that are established? How fragile are we? And particularly in 2020, as we look forward to an era of we're in the middle of an era of populism right around the world, and the norms that we thought we'd created are under threat like never before. Do you see these as established, or do we have to keep fighting for them?
Oh, I think we have to keep fighting for them. Every minute of every day, I think they're completely fragile. And, I think that there has been, in this country, just a realignment of, if you're going to do business here, whether as a big law firm or company or whatever else, notwithstanding what the law is, you just have to provide a situation in which talented professionals or other people can work in your workplace. So to the extent you can align it with self-interest, perhaps they are a little less fragile. I'm kind of an optimist in the sense where I think on the one hand our legal rights are under threat. In terms of reproductive rights, that's, I'm sure, completely obvious to everyone. But what that often promotes is that people more generally say, "Yikes!" These are, and they become politically engaged, and they start changing the people that they vote for at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, because all of a sudden these rights that the courts have protected, are truly under threat.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm an optimist, is that the courts are not democratic institutions. There are things you can accomplish through it during certain periods of time. But what really protects us is, all of us, voting for people who are going to, as I said earlier, get shit done.
And talk about get shit done. I mean, the years that you and I were working with Pangea, I mean, coming back to harm reduction, I mean, we had programs in China, in Tanzania, in Oakland, and this was implementing essentially the hard fought for achievements that you and others from the legal, from the medical profession, from the advocacy movement, Martin Delaney, Pat Kristen, and others had got during that sort of early to mid 1990s phase. And I'm really interested in how you remain optimistic and sort of what, beyond the foundation of the courts, what it is that sort of, inspires you and helps you to keep pushing people to move forward.
It's the fact that, I still know all those people. They're still fighting and expanding, the group of people, that are fighting and what they're fighting for. So those bonds that we all formed early in the epidemic, those are still intact, and they've only, expanded and grown to, just a huge number of people who felt like things were kind of okay. In my profession, at my age, I know a lot of lawyers, who are retired, right? But not a single one of them that I know isn't asking me, what can I do? Where can I go to do voter protection in 2020? There was an army of lawyers in Nevada in 2016 and 2018 from San Francisco, from the San Francisco legal community. This afternoon, I'm going to a meeting of a group of women lawyers plus a few non-lawyers who are still active from that time. They're called the change agents, appropriately enough, and we're, this is a group of women I grew up with in the city and that I adore, and they're not stopping. They're more energetic than they ever were. I probably, if things were different, if 2016 would have been different, would have lost touch with them. But we're like, we're a pretty fearsome and awesome group.
Oh, yes. I feel as if we're really only skimming the surface of many of the issues that are really important to a Shot in the Arm podcast, to the sort of the intersection of health and human rights. And before we wrap up, and I really don't normally ask this of guests, but what have I missed? What have we missed? What really do we need to make sure that our listeners and viewers need to know?
That is such a great question. I feel like our listeners and viewers need to know is that, first of all, we got this.
Yeah.
With their help, we got this. And that it's really just about saying yes and yes and yes to the situation that exists now and fighting for it and doing everything. It's just like during the epidemic when everyone was dying and we didn't know if there would ever be, let alone a cure, any people's, longevity. It's, we have to be here for the cure. And it's like an all hands on deck situation. And so I find myself saying that really listening to and reading a lot about people who knew they weren't going to be around for the solution. The activists who know they're not going to be around, who are too old, too sick, to something to really be an optimist, but it's about what one of my fabulous older mentors at MoFo told me at some point is that, you know, he's at an age where he probably shouldn't, but he still buys green bananas. Right?
Because they will ripen.
They will ripen, but maybe his grandkids or his kids will eat them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, I am quite sure there is much more passion, much more vigor in the work that you are doing and your leadership, Kathy. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show. It's been an absolute delight and honor to have you and to hear your perspective on what happened and its relevance to our future. Kathy Fisher, you are a shot in the arm.
Thank you, Ben.
Well, that's it for this episode. Hope you've enjoyed the show. We would love to know your thoughts on the subjects we've covered and the issues you think we ought to address. Please contact us through the usual social networks, including Twitter and Facebook at ShotArm Podcast. Our thanks go to our producer and director, Eric Aspera of NewsDoc Media, and to Brian Regas and our intern, Will Lansdale. This episode is dedicated to the life of Christian Kroll, who died recently. Now, I had the honor of serving with Christian while he and I were at UNAIDS, and he led the UNODC's HIV strategies in the 2000s through some very, very choppy political waters. The world is a much better place because of him. Thank you, Christian. And thanks to you for joining us. Have a great week, everyone.